Alrighty, here we go. So I'm going to do a quick recording here. I think this is pod 41 based on the fact that I've got 39 in traditional podcast format, and then I did like a brief video basically summarizing where I'm at in the new game Assassin's Creed Shadows, set in 1500s Japan, I think, and so I was doing that, and so that became a bit of a pod. As far as these pods are concerned, I've sort of judged that the podcasts are not drawing much attention, I would say, so I think they're still worth the doing based on the topics I've been able to do, and I think even the ones that I did on Plato early on and the ones on Homer, I thought that those were pretty good, and I do actually intend to continue both the Page of Plato series, continuing Plato's Phaedo. I've just gotten a little bit sidetracked in terms of just trying to figure out, as far as the channel is concerned, what sort of content is gonna work well. It looks like my music is the primary content that's getting viewership, you might say, and so in light of that, it might be better to focus more in that area, but who knows, if I made enough Assassin's Creed Shadows videos to make a channel out of that, maybe that's a possibility, but I don't really see that as a serious possibility. I think still the music content is good content. I will say some of the recent content has been slightly mediocre, you might say, and that's my judgment of myself. So if anybody enjoys one of the recent tracks I've put out, and I'm not including the ones from yesterday, but I've definitely put out a few good content recently, but some of the postings from a week or a week and a half's time, maybe not quite as strong, but again, I'm still trying to figure out how to get viewership on the videos, etc., and continuing to develop along those lines. But I will say that content-wise, it's not that I've run the gamut of things that I can do within the content I have, but sometime soon, and maybe it's a good thing to even do it anyway, but I'm going to consider investing in more content, whether it's new systems and programs to use, although who knows if my laptop can handle that, but more likely as well, just trying to get some new sound pools on there. But again, I don't know how that will work with my laptop and the storage component of everything, but so that notwithstanding, having drolled on about that for about 4 minutes, thing that I wanted to briefly discuss was, so I'm reading through Dance with Dragons, book 5 in the Game of Thrones series, and basically coming to the end of the written content that I can really analyze from this sort of universe, etc. And so I've been able to see some chapters from, they've got, so that's the Queen's Guard, so that's Barristan Selmy, and then they had a Victorian Greyjoy chapter, and so there's a lot of stuff going on, but I wanted to do a quick analysis. So yeah, even there was a Tyrion chapter where basically he looks like he just led his fellow dwarf Penny and Jorah Mormont to escape from whatever dude bought them recently, and then he just weighed his way over the Second Sons, and Brown Ben Plum, who's, don't remember him from the show, but again, that's where the characters in the book are substantially different than the characters on the show in a lot of ways, especially this fifth book. I think it was in this book too that we saw Tyrion basically riding down the Rhine River, getting to see, that sort of giant turtles, all that stuff associated with that sort of river civilization, and so saw all that stuff. And then Tyrion's made his way to Brown Ben Plum and trying to reason with him. But the content that I'm interested in for today is, so I just read a Jon chapter, Jon Snow that is, and I think this chapter really crystallizes a lot of things about fan theories about him. George basically laying some things out fairly clearly, and essentially there are theories that I've been hearing for some time that are looking more and more correct. And then I guess my point here is going to be that it's interesting to then kind of assess how there were people who, when, especially basically the people who made Game of Thrones, Dan and Dave, or whoever those D&D, whatever their deal is, but those dudes, understanding essentially why they were picked for the show by George, and if the legend is accurate, it's basically because they identified Jon as kind of the Azor Ahai son of Rhaegar Targaryen sort of character fairly early, where there's something predictive that they did where essentially George R.R. Martin kind of approved of them for being able to deduce something that George had not yet written into the books. And so this book's an example of that, where this is book 5, so there's other books that have been written before this one, and people have probably been making their theories. But so in this chapter, Jon, at this point, he's already done sort of the ranging thing you see on the show, and similar the Corn Half Hand and yada yada yada. And now he's back, and he's Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and he's basically been put in that position by Sam Tarly, who he then sent away with Maester Aemon, essentially, to try and get them and the baby safely away from Stannis or whoever might want to sacrifice them, essentially, whatever. But anyway, in his capacity as commander of the Night's Watch, Jon in this chapter is really interesting. I don't remember anything like this from the show, but Jon, is having to wrestle with all these things. It's like every chapter Jon is involved in. Jon is essentially, he's recognized into the position of being an authority, meaning, he's no longer friends with his fellows, and he has to, in some ways, put up with the insubordination of, his lieutenants, like, what was his name, Bowen Marsh, or his steward, his chief steward, essentially, and Yarwick, and some of these other people who are essentially kind of, number one, they're sort of questioning how experienced Jon is, although clearly the sort of thing about, Jon being picked for the steward role for the Lord Commander means they were grooming him for command. And then, like in a recent chapter, it was interesting, the person Jon picked for that steward role is this, I don't know if it's because the other people in the thing, a Night Watcher, call him, or hermaphrodite or whatever, but or if I'm mixing that up with that other character, it doesn't even matter. But they basically he's grooming somebody now for command. Either that, or he's actually just using them as the cupbearer steward sort of thing. And the men have kind of looked at that, and they're kind of like, oh, that's a weird decision. Why'd you promote him? Blah, blah, blah. So they're kind of questioning everything that he does. But, it's pretty clear he's doing a pretty good job. And he's doing this thing, which I don't know if I did this in a previous pod or intended to do it at one point, but just to talk about the interesting nature of the Ned Stark character, that he's obviously in the first book, and then you hear people, basically it's mostly Robin and John, they're the ones that kind of remember things that Ned said and did, and etc. But all the children of Ned are constantly remembering those things, and so there's a lot of interesting things that are composing John's character right now, and he's basically doing a pretty solid Ned impression. And one of the things he's dealing with is that, so in the book, John is letting a lot of the wildlings pass through the wall and go into the south, and he's doing that because he essentially he wants to avoid as many of the wildlings being killed as possible, so he doesn't have to eventually fight them in sort of the army of the dead. And then what's interesting about that is that, so in this chapter that I was reading just now outside, so just the start of it is, that night he dreamt of wildlings howling from the woods, advancing to the moan of war horns and the roll of drums, and blah blah blah. And then stand fast, Jon Snow called, throw them back. He stood atop the wall alone. Flame, he cried, feed them flame. There was no one to pay him heed. They're all gone, they've abandoned me. Blah blah blah. Snow and Eagle cried. Jon was armored in black ice, but his blade burned red in his fist. As the dead men reached the top of the wall, he sent them down to die again. He slew a gray-beard, a beardless boy, a giant, a gaunt man with filed teeth, a girl with thick red hair. Too late he recognized Ygritte. She was gone as quick as she appeared. The world dissolved into a red mist. Jon stabbed and slashed and cut. He hacked down Donald Noy and gutted. Deaf Dick followed. Corn Halfhand stumbled to his knees, trying in vain to staunch the flow of blood from his neck. I am the Lord of Winterfell, Jon screamed. It was Robb before him now, his hair wet with melting snow. Longclaw took his head off. Then a gnarled hand seized Jon roughly by the shoulder. He whirled and woke with a raven pecking at his chest. Snow, the bird cried. Jon swatted at it. Raven shrieked its displeasure and flapped up to a bedpost to glare down balefully at him through the pre-dawn gloom. So, as this chapter rolls on, so it literally lays it out. The day had come, it was the hour of the wolf. Soon enough sun would rise, 4,000 wildlings would come pouring through the wall. So Jon basically is like, well, it should have been the Old Bear, Jeremy Riker, Corn Halfhand, Dennis Mallister, some other seasoned man, my uncle. Too late for such misgivings. Every choice has its risk, every choice has consequences. He would play the game to its conclusion. And then obviously he's got the bird in the room. Mormont's raven muttered across the room, corn, the bird said, and king, and snow, Jon Snow, Jon Snow. That was queer. The bird had never spoke his full name before, as best Jon could recall. And then Jon is at breakfast with his fellows, and blah blah blah. So that set of paragraphs at the beginning of this paragraph are the important parts, and it follows a certain formula that George does for these paragraphs, where if there's sort of an occasion for it, the person might be sleeping, having some sort of dream and or psychological reaction to a dream, etc. And then the waking up is incorporated as sort of the beginning of the chapter, and in this instance, what's going on, to spoil a bit of things in terms of Endgame, Game of Thrones, and theories, whatever, is if you read that at the beginning of that chapter, which is, it's a Jon Snow chapter, and if you read that as anything other than Jon is eventually going to be Azor Ahai, or is Azor Ahai, or has already done the Azor Ahai thing, even if the Azor Ahai thing is essentially like, oh, it's just a metaphor of what he has to do in that dream, which doesn't sound like the best explanation, but, the thing that so many people are motivated by, especially the sort of red priests of R'hllor, sort of religious people, which is displayed mostly by Melisandre, who we've already seen that she's a much more or much less omniscient character than she tries to affect herself as being. And so it's interesting that, she's essentially delusional, because she should know essentially at this point, I'm only seeing Jon Snow in the flames, not seeing Stannis, blah blah blah, and I'm seeing knives all around Jon Snow, etc. So she knows that Jon is probably in danger, but she doesn't understand that Jon is likely Azor Ahai in terms of essentially the hero who's gonna turn the tide of the long night by essentially sacrificing the woman he loves with a blade that he spends however many nights folding over itself, the sort of Valyrian steel armoring process of creating a Valyrian steel weapon. And so you could let's see. Well, the whole point of that Azor Ahai sort of story is that it's essentially, it's sort of a metaphorical or mythical, legendary sort of story about what happened in the Long Night, the original Long Night, the one that's already happened, and therefore, it only can really have a religious significance in terms of if there's some sort of cyclical nature of things where the events are going to be repeated in terms of the Long Night coming again, and Azor Ahai again being the savior of humanity sort of thing. But the good thing about this sort of universe, I guess, is the sort of interesting nature of how you don't necessarily know whether any of these religious prophecies or anything are actually going to bear out. And like we saw with Melisandre, these religious figures tend to be a little bit less certain of themselves when they take their masks off. The only people that aren't really is like the High Sparrow dude, who's currently doing his thing with Queen Cersei in terms of holding her prisoner. But anyway, so the point of sort of the Azor Ahai story is essentially, though, that the hero has a flaming sword, and the reason he has the flaming sword is he spent all the time crafting it, and then in order to sort of quench the sword, to finish it, get it to its final form, etc., he puts it through the heart of the woman he loves, and that blood sacrifice then sort of sanctifies the blade, bathes it in flame, etc. And so, from what we know, especially Melisandre, it's a little hard to take her seriously, because it's like, hey dummy, if your Azor Ahai is having to do magic tricks with what is likely some form of wildfire on a common sword as a mummer's trick, essentially, to make people think that he has Lightbringer. It's like, well, why don't you do a little math there, Einstein? If you're doing all this stupid shit to prop up your chosen politician, maybe they're not the one. And so, anyway, this beginning of the chapter clearly, makes it seem as if John is Azor Ahai, that essentially the creators of the show, etc., the people who've known for the longest have kind of perceived in a lot of the John chapters, and I would argue there's something similar going on in Tyrion's chapters as well, but maybe to a lesser degree, but there's something going on where John is clearly super, super important, is having to go through all these things, and kind of the Azor Ahai story is, I guess, that at the end, when faced with the sort of long night and with death and everything, Azor Ahai faces that alone, and Azor Ahai, again, is fighting with a flaming sword, so it's not a mummer's trick, but again, a flaming sword might be a sword of Valyrian steel, aka steel so impressively better than regular steel it might as well be a sword of dragon flame. And so you can see clearly that there are echoes of this where John is calling for flame, feed them flame, there's no one to pay him heed, they've abandoned him, and then he's armored in black ice, so he might as well just be the wall himself. And then he's got his blade turned red in his fist, and then, again, like the Night's Watch literally has like a scythe sort of blade that they will loose on the wall at certain times when they've got wildlings climbing it. And so, again, though, it's pretty clear that they're making a sort of Azor Ahai sort of hint in this paragraph. And by they, I mean, this is George R. R. Martin himself, though. And then the sort of capper is, too late he recognized Ygritte, and he's, sending people down to die again. And so, and then the funny thing about all that in retrospect then is, so the world dissolved into a red mist. John stabbed and slashed, he cut down all these various people. It's funny, he doesn't cut down, though, he doesn't cut down his uncle Benjen, and he's only been cutting down dead people. So maybe put two and two together on that one as well. But again, him cutting down Ygritte is a clear sort of Azor Ahai sort of allusion. And then the other part of this that's interesting is, so then John screams, "I'm the Lord of Winterfell." It was Robb before him now, hair wet with melting snow. Longclaw took his head off. So I don't really know how to interpret that quite, other than to interpret the sentence-ish afterwards. But he's hacking down all these people: Donald Noy, Deaf Dick, Follard, Corin Halfhand, all these other people that he would have wanted, like he said in the other thing, to be treating with the wildlings, more experience, etc. And then it changes. He says, "I am the Lord of Winterfell," so he's arguably just sort of embracing all the bad instincts of the resentment of Robb and wanting to take Robb's place, and "I am the Lord of Winterfell," and then that means he has to take the head of Robb, etc., which I guess, thinking about that, that's kind of the clearest proof of essentially why a Dance with the Dragon sort of situation was necessary, if there really were going to be two truly viable heirs, one of whom was designated to the heir and the other one was so obviously heir material that it was clear that other people were going to try to install that person. But what's interesting is that after he beheads Robb in his dream, which I'm going to assume, again, this is a dream, it's all metaphorical, etc. And so, thinking about it in that respect, essentially, especially because John is, he's a skin changer, he's a warg with ghosts, etc. So he's tapped into sort of similar networks that the children of the forest and the people with Bran essentially are. And the cappers essentially, when George throws in the little detail that after John takes Rob's head off with Longclaw, Gnarled Hand sees John roughly by his shoulder. So you might interpret that as possibly, well, Bran is out there tripping, going through all these memories, and clearly, speaking to his father and the godswood and doing all these things that are definitely having impacts on reality. So you could say it's Bran, but the Gnarled Hand detail makes it fit much more so as Brynden Rivers' Blood Raven sort of reference, and so sort of cap it all off, it brings it back up to the point that everything is Blood Raven's fault. Blood Raven is behind everything, and essentially what this means in terms of reinterpreting that beginning of this beginning of this chapter is essentially that Blood Raven knows that John is Azor Ahai, or believes John is Azor Ahai, and is preparing him for that, sending him dreams, etc. And then the cappers that before John basically gets out of control and is cutting the heads off of people that he would regret doing that for. Instead of that, you've got a situation where the hand seizes him roughly by the shoulder, and then the capper on top of that is he whirls and woke with a raven pecking at his chest. Snow, the bird cried. And so the thing about that is, so again, is a raven. This raven is Lord Mormont's raven, but depending on, I guess, if there's more information about this, etc., I essentially wouldn't be surprised if it's literally a Brynden Rivers raven from his time that's essentially not bewitched, but has been imbued with the power to sort of be part of the network of Blood Raven. And so sort of the evidence for this, number one, bird is raven. Part two, Brynden Rivers is a Blackwood of Raven Tree, which we just saw in a few chapters previously that Jaime was at Raven Tree to accept the Blackwood surrender because he was having the Brackens take them and it was taking too long, and so Jaime goes and accepts their surrender, and there's all sorts of stuff at Raven Tree, etc., which is evocative of Blood Raven. So Blood Raven's obviously of that culture, and it essentially wouldn't be that hard of a metaphorical leap to be like, oh, the Raven is literally one of Blood Raven, the Raven's teeth, also the company of the archers that Brynden Rivers commanded. There's just too many things to think it's a complete coincidence. So the combination of Gnarled Hand, the Raven that people will say is sent by Blood Raven to kind of speak certain messages to people, blah, 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 that basically, Blood Raven's behind this whole thing. And so that's an interesting idea and just an interesting way to start that chapter. And then it ends with the letter from Cotter Pike at Hardhome. And so I just think that chapter is really interesting because, like I said, I think the detailing of how these books are coming together is really preferable to the show. I'm just not remembering anything of this quality being in the show of like the later seasons in terms of the nuances of what's going on. And then Like even the scene that they did a few chapters ago where Danny was at the fighting pits, and then basically eventually her dragon comes in and she flies off on her dragon, and it's just such a different storyline than what they did in the show, and seems to me better than what it is that they came up with on the show, even though it's similar enough. So but that's it. I'm going to pause right here because I'm sort of running out of steam. I want to get back to other things, but I just wanted to quickly record this pod because I think it's so interesting, just this book series, and that's why I'd be interested to develop ideas along these lines, because there's just so much material to go on, whether it was something like I did the other time where you're discussing like a character like a Quentin Ball or whatever. There's so many great characters and great world building in this series that there's lots of material to go on, and likely will be for some amount of time. So that's it. I'm gonna pause here though. All right, thanks.